People can laugh at the way you look for years, but it only takes one moment for the truth to make every voice in the room fall silent. Alicia Brooks had learned that lesson long before anyone else around her understood it. At 34 years old, she no longer expected strangers to see beyond the color of her skin or the shape of her body. She was a black woman with a warm smile, gentle eyes, and a full figure that many people judged before she ever spoke a single word. Every time someone introduced her to a man, the ending felt painfully familiar. Some politely declined a second meeting. Others never called again. A few were cruel enough to whisper that she was simply too fat and too black to be anyone's first choice. Those words had followed her for years, yet they never changed the kindness in her heart. Every morning before sunrise, Alicia unlocked the doors of Sweet Magnolia Bakery in downtown Seattle, where she worked as the head pastry chef. The smell of fresh butter, cinnamon, and warm bread filled the kitchen before the rest of the city even opened its eyes. She believed desserts should bring comfort, not attention, and she quietly poured every ounce of care into each cake she decorated. Her co-workers admired her talent, but outside those kitchen walls, most people noticed only her appearance. That Saturday afternoon, Sweet Magnolia had been hired to provide desserts for one of the most exclusive charity banquets in the city. The event was held inside the Grand Evergreen Hotel, where business leaders, celebrities, politicians, and wealthy philanthropists gathered beneath crystal chandeliers to raise money for children's education programs. Alicia arrived hours before the guests, carefully arranging handcrafted pastries, fruit tarts, chocolate sculptures, and an elegant 5-tier dessert display that had taken nearly 3 days to complete. By evening, the ballroom shimmered with polished marble floors, golden candlelight, and the soft music of a live string quartet. Guests arrived dressed in tailored tuxedos and designer gowns, greeting one another with polished smiles and confident laughter. Alicia quietly adjusted the dessert table one final time, before stepping aside to allow the catering staff to begin serving. She preferred remaining invisible during events like these. It was easier that way. A small group of well-dressed guests wandered toward the dessert display, admiring the elaborate decorations before one woman glanced at Alicia. Her smile quickly changed into an expression of amused disbelief. "She made these?" the woman asked loudly enough for others nearby to hear. A man standing beside her chuckled. "I guess she spends more time tasting desserts than making them." Another guest laughed. "Someone should tell her this is a charity gala, not an all-you-can-eat buffet." Their laughter spread through the nearby crowd. Several people smiled awkwardly while pretending not to hear. Others looked away, unwilling to interrupt the uncomfortable moment. Alicia lowered her eyes for only a second before calmly continuing to straighten a serving tray as though the comments had never been spoken. Years of quiet endurance had taught her that arguing rarely changed hearts already filled with prejudice. Across the ballroom, a distinguished older man paused in the middle of a conversation. Richard Walker had entered the gala with little interest in social gatherings. At 70 years old, the white businessman known privately among powerful circles as a respected Korean mafia boss rarely attended charity events unless they served a meaningful purpose. His reputation had been built on discipline, loyalty, and an extraordinary ability to read people long before they revealed their true character. He had noticed the laughter before he noticed Alicia herself. His eyes slowly followed the sound until he saw the woman standing beside the dessert table. She neither defended herself nor displayed anger. She simply continued arranging the plates with steady hands and quiet dignity. Richard observed the guests who had mocked her. Their expensive clothing reflected wealth. Their behavior revealed something entirely different. One of his longtime associates leaned closer and quietly asked whether they should move to another part of the ballroom. Richard did not answer immediately. His attention remained fixed on Alicia as she politely thanked another server and helped an elderly guest carry a dessert plate without expecting recognition or appreciation. There was no bitterness in her expression, only calm determination to finish her work with excellence despite the humiliation surrounding her. Richard had spent decades surrounded by powerful people, yet genuine character had become increasingly difficult to find. Something about the quiet woman near the dessert table unsettled him in a way he could not immediately explain. The laughter around her gradually faded, but his attention never did. He had not looked away once. The cruelest judgments often disappear the moment real skill is forced to reveal itself. Alicia Brooks quietly continued serving desserts as conversations returned to business deals, charitable donations, and polite laughter. The comments directed at her only minutes earlier seemed to have vanished from everyone else's memory, yet they lingered quietly in the air like invisible fingerprints. Alicia did not allow herself to dwell on them. She had learned long ago that bitterness only stole energy from the work she loved. Instead, she carefully inspected each dessert station, making certain every pastry remained fresh and every serving plate looked perfect beneath the ballroom lights. Near the center of the grand display stood the evening's centerpiece, an elegant 6-foot wedding-style cake created specifically for the charity auction. Every layer had been decorated with delicate sugar flowers, hand-painted gold accents, and intricate white chocolate lace. The cake represented more than 2 days of nearly non-stop work from the entire bakery team. It was expected to become the highlight of the evening's fundraising auction, where the winning bidder would donate thousands of dollars to support educational programs for children across Washington state. As guests slowly gathered around the display, one of the catering assistants hurried past carrying a heavy tray of crystal glasses. A small section of the carpet had curled upward beneath the serving table, almost impossible to notice beneath the elegant decorations. The assistant stumbled slightly. Although the tray never fell, the serving table shifted just enough for one of the support legs beneath the massive cake platform to slide several inches out of position. Almost immediately, the towering cake leaned slightly to one side. Most people failed to notice the movement. Alicia noticed it instantly. Years of professional experience had trained her eyes to recognize even the smallest imbalance. She crossed the ballroom without hesitation, carefully slipping behind the dessert display before anyone else realized what was happening. Remaining perfectly calm, she examined the base and immediately understood the problem. The support platform had twisted just enough to place dangerous pressure on the lower layers. If the weight continued shifting for even another minute, the entire centerpiece would collapse before hundreds of guests. Alicia quickly called 2 nearby servers to steady the table while she carefully removed several decorative elements from the upper tiers, reducing enough weight to stabilize the structure. She requested additional wooden support blocks from the catering supply room and quietly directed the staff with remarkable confidence. Every instruction was clear, precise, and calm. Within minutes, the hidden support beneath the platform had been reinforced. The cake stood perfectly level once again, and every decoration had been restored so seamlessly that most guests never realized anything had happened. Applause erupted only moments later as the master of ceremonies introduced the auction centerpiece. The audience admired the magnificent cake without knowing how close they had come to witnessing a public disaster. Alicia stepped away from the display, gently wiping a small trace of icing from her hands before preparing fresh dessert plates for the next group of guests. Instead of receiving gratitude, she was suddenly confronted by the banquet manager, whose face showed visible frustration. "Miss Brooks," he said in a strained voice, "you should have informed me before moving anything around the centerpiece. If our guests had noticed, it could have created unnecessary concern." Alicia listened respectfully before answering. "I believe preventing the problem immediately was the safest option." The manager sighed impatiently. "Next time, follow the proper chain of command." Without waiting for a response, he turned and walked away. Several employees exchanged uncomfortable glances, fully aware that Alicia had just saved the most expensive display in the ballroom. Yet no one challenged the manager's criticism. Across the room, Richard Walker had witnessed every second of the incident. He had watched Alicia recognize the danger before anyone else. He had watched her solve the problem without panic. Most importantly, he had watched her accept unfair criticism without resentment or self-pity. His longtime associate quietly leaned toward him. "Should I speak with the event organizers?" he asked. Richard slowly shook his head. "Not yet," he replied in a calm voice. His eyes remained fixed on the restored centerpiece, while Alicia returned to arranging desserts exactly as though nothing unusual had happened. Around them, guests admired the flawless cake, praising its beauty without ever realizing whose steady hands had preserved it. Richard looked once more toward the quiet pastry chef, and for the first time that evening, a single question settled firmly in his mind. Who was the woman everyone else seemed determined to overlook? Some hearts reveal themselves through grand speeches, but the rarest ones are discovered in the quiet moments when no one believes they are being watched. The charity auction continued beneath the sparkling chandeliers as generous donors applauded each successful bid, raising hundreds of thousands of dollars for children's education. Laughter once again filled the ballroom, and conversations drifted effortlessly between business opportunities and philanthropic achievements. Yet Richard Walker found himself paying very little attention to the stage. His thoughts remained fixed on the quiet pastry chef who had prevented an embarrassing disaster only to receive criticism instead of gratitude. Alicia Brooks moved gracefully from one dessert station to another, replenishing pastries, adjusting serving trays, and politely thanking every waiter who assisted her. She never attempted to claim credit for saving the centerpiece cake. In fact, she behaved as though nothing unusual had happened. Richard had spent most of his life surrounded by people eager to receive recognition for the smallest accomplishments. Watching someone deliberately avoid attention felt unexpectedly refreshing. As the auction reached its final item, Richard quietly signaled one of his trusted associates. "Find out who she is," he said calmly. The associate nodded without asking further questions. Less than 20 minutes later, he returned with a small folder gathered from conversations with the catering company. "Her name is Alicia Brooks," he explained softly. "She has worked at Sweet Magnolia Bakery for nearly 8 years. Everyone agrees she is the most talented pastry chef they have, but she refuses management positions because she says she enjoys creating desserts more than supervising employees." Richard listened without interrupting. "Anything else?" he asked. The associate hesitated before continuing. "Several people mentioned something unusual. Every Saturday morning before reporting to work, she delivers birthday cakes to foster homes across the city. She pays for many of the ingredients herself. The bakery owner only discovered it because one of the delivery drivers recognized her." Richard looked up slowly. "Does anyone sponsor the program?" The associate shook his head. "No. Apparently, she has been doing it quietly for years. She never speaks about it." Richard remained silent for a long moment. Wealthy donors inside the ballroom had just received standing ovations for writing generous checks that photographers eagerly documented. Meanwhile, a woman earning an ordinary salary had been spending her own money to celebrate children who might otherwise never receive a birthday cake, and almost nobody knew. The discovery unsettled him far more deeply than he expected. His curiosity continued growing. Later that evening, while guests enjoyed coffee and dessert, Richard walked slowly toward the pastry station. Alicia was carefully arranging fresh slices of cake on elegant white plates. She looked up as he approached and greeted him with the same warm smile she offered every guest. "Good evening, sir," she said kindly. "Would you care for a slice of vanilla almond or dark chocolate?" Richard glanced briefly at the desserts before answering. "Which one would you recommend?" Alicia smiled gently. "The vanilla almond. It has a lighter finish, especially after a large dinner." Richard accepted the plate with a grateful nod. After tasting the first bite, he paused. The cake was delicate, perfectly balanced, and remarkably refined. It reminded him of desserts served at prestigious restaurants around the world, yet it carried something those expensive creations often lacked. It tasted comforting rather than impressive. "You made this?" he asked. Alicia nodded modestly. "Our entire team worked together on the menu." Richard looked at her for another moment. "You are generous with your answers," he observed. "Most people would have taken full credit." Alicia lowered her eyes slightly before responding. "Good work is rarely done by only one person." Her answer lingered in Richard's thoughts long after the conversation ended. As she returned to serving guests, one of the younger waitresses accidentally dropped a tray of dessert forks onto the polished marble floor. The metallic clatter echoed through the ballroom, drawing several irritated looks from nearby tables. Before embarrassment could overwhelm the young employee, Alicia quietly knelt beside her, helping gather every fork while softly reassuring her that accidents happen to everyone. The waitress's trembling hands gradually steadied, and a grateful smile replaced the panic on her face. Richard watched the exchange without moving. The woman everyone else had judged so quickly seemed to possess an effortless habit of protecting other people's dignity before protecting her own. For reasons he could not yet explain, he found himself wanting to know not simply who Alicia Brooks was, But what kind of life had shaped a heart that remained so gentle after enduring so much unkindness? Sometimes the greatest inheritance a person receives is not money, beauty, or opportunity, but a single sentence that quietly changes the way they choose to live forever. The charity banquet gradually drew to a close as guests exchanged business cards, congratulated one another on successful donations, and slowly departed beneath the warm lights of the Grand Evergreen Hotel. Catering staff began clearing tables while musicians packed away their instruments, leaving only the soft sounds of rolling carts and quiet conversations drifting through the ballroom. Alicia Brooks remained focused on her work, carefully wrapping untouched pastries for donation to a local family shelter rather than allowing perfectly good food to go to waste. It was a routine she followed after every large event, one she never discussed because she believed generosity lost something precious the moment it became a performance. While organizing a storage cart, she noticed a small leather notebook resting beside one of the serving stations. It had likely slipped from her personal bag earlier in the evening when she rushed to stabilize the centerpiece cake. Alicia immediately recognized it. The worn brown cover had softened over years of careful use, and inside were handwritten recipes, baking notes, and one treasured item she carried everywhere. Tucked safely between 2 pages rested a folded letter written by her late mother many years before her passing. Whenever difficult days made her question her own worth, Alicia quietly reread those familiar words before returning to work. As she reached the station, another pair of hands gently lifted the notebook first. Richard Walker looked at the cover before offering it back with respectful care. "I believe this belongs to you," he said. Alicia smiled gratefully. "Thank you, sir. It means more to me than it probably looks." As she accepted the notebook, the folded letter slipped quietly onto the polished floor without either of them noticing. Alicia thanked him once more before helping another employee carry serving trays toward the kitchen. Richard remained where he stood until his attention settled on the cream-colored envelope near his shoes. He carefully picked it up, intending only to return it, but before he could call after Alicia, the letter unfolded slightly in his hands. His eyes caught only the opening sentence. "My beautiful daughter, the world will judge your appearance long before it discovers your heart." Richard immediately looked away, recognizing the private nature of the letter. Yet those few words lingered in his mind with unexpected force. They reminded him of someone he had known decades earlier, someone whose quiet wisdom had altered the direction of his own life. He carefully folded the page exactly as he had found it and walked toward the kitchen entrance. Alicia was thanking several co-workers before preparing donation boxes for the shelter. Richard approached without interrupting. "Miss Brooks," he said softly. Alicia turned with a warm smile. "Yes, sir." He extended the folded letter toward her. Relief immediately appeared across her face. "I did not even realize it had fallen out," she admitted. She accepted it with both hands and carefully placed it back inside the notebook before gently closing the cover. Richard hesitated for a brief moment. "Was that written by your mother?" Alicia nodded. "A few months before she passed away." Her voice remained calm, but her eyes softened with quiet remembrance. "Whenever life becomes difficult, I read it again. Somehow she always knows exactly what I need to hear." Richard remained thoughtful. "She sounds like a remarkable woman." Alicia smiled gently. She believed people should never allow other people's opinions to become louder than their own conscience. Those words settled deeply inside Richard. They echoed with another memory he still carried after many years, though he could not yet understand why the connection felt so immediate. Before leaving, he simply inclined his head respectfully. "Thank you for sharing that," he said. Alicia watched him walk away before returning to her work, unaware that the brief exchange had awakened something buried inside the older man's memory. As Richard stepped into the quiet hotel corridor, surrounded now by silence instead of celebration, he realized that the letter had stirred emotions he had not revisited in decades. For the first time in many years, he found himself wondering whether destiny had placed Alicia Brooks in his path for a reason far greater than either of them yet understood. The people who quietly prepare for ordinary days are often the first to know exactly what to do when extraordinary moments arrive without warning. Nearly 2 weeks passed after the charity banquet, and life settled back into its familiar rhythm. Alicia Brooks returned to Sweet Magnolia Bakery before dawn each morning, spending long hours perfecting pastries before making her Saturday deliveries to foster homes throughout Seattle. Richard Walker found himself thinking about her far more often than he expected. During business meetings, her calm voice occasionally echoed in his memory. During formal dinners, he remembered the simple elegance of the vanilla almond cake she had recommended. Most of all, he remembered the handwritten letter from her mother and the quiet strength that seemed to shape every decision Alicia made. Their paths crossed again during a spring fundraising celebration hosted at the Seattle Children's History Museum, where several nonprofit organizations had gathered to thank donors and volunteers. Sweet Magnolia Bakery had once again been invited to provide desserts, and Alicia happily accepted the assignment because the event included dozens of children from foster families she already knew by name. The museum buzzed with cheerful conversations as children explored interactive exhibits while parents, volunteers, and community leaders enjoyed refreshments nearby. Richard attended as one of the event's principal benefactors, accompanied by his adult daughter, Emily, and his 8-year-old granddaughter, Sophie. Unlike many formal gatherings, this afternoon carried an atmosphere of genuine joy rather than social competition. Sophie eagerly hurried from one exhibit to another, fascinated by displays about early aviation and space exploration. Alicia smiled as she watched the children laugh together while quietly arranging colorful dessert plates decorated with fresh strawberries and blueberries. She noticed Sophie selecting a small pastry from the dessert table before running back toward her grandfather. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Then, only a few minutes later, Alicia happened to glance across the room and saw the young girl, rubbing her throat with a confused expression. Sophie's breathing appeared uncomfortable, and her face quickly became flushed. Emily immediately knelt beside her daughter, her own expression changing from confusion to alarm. Several nearby guests gathered anxiously, offering conflicting suggestions while uncertainty spread through the room. Alicia recognized the warning signs almost instantly. Years earlier, one of the foster children she regularly baked for had experienced severe food allergies, and Alicia had completed volunteer emergency response training so she would know how to react if something similar ever happened again. Without hesitation or panic, she calmly approached Emily. "Has Sophie ever had a serious food allergy?" she asked gently. Emily's eyes widened. "Tree nuts," she answered quickly. "She carries emergency medication, but I left my purse with our coats near the entrance." Alicia immediately turned to a nearby volunteer. "Please bring her purse as quickly as you can. Tell the front desk to call emergency medical services immediately." Her voice remained steady, reassuring everyone around her without raising it. She then encouraged Emily to keep Sophie calm and sitting comfortably, while carefully asking simple questions that helped monitor the child's condition. Richard watched everything unfold with remarkable composure, but inside he felt the helpless concern every grandfather would experience. He noticed that Alicia never tried to take control from Sophie's mother. Instead, she quietly supported her, offering calm guidance while ensuring every second was used wisely. Within moments, the volunteer returned with Emily's purse. Following Emily's instructions, the emergency medication was administered appropriately while paramedics were already on their way. The atmosphere gradually shifted from panic to cautious relief as Sophie's breathing steadily improved. When emergency responders arrived, they praised the quick recognition of the symptoms and explained that the prompt response had prevented the situation from becoming significantly more serious. Emily embraced her daughter with grateful tears in her eyes before turning toward Alicia. "Thank you," she whispered sincerely. "I do not know how I can ever repay you." Alicia gently shook her head with a warm smile. "You do not owe me anything. I simply recognized what was happening because another child once taught me how important those first few minutes can be." Richard stood silently nearby, watching the exchange with profound respect. Once again, Alicia had acted without seeking praise, attention, or recognition. She had simply noticed someone in need and quietly stepped forward while everyone else was still trying to understand what was happening. As Sophie smiled weakly and reached for her grandfather's hand, Richard realized that the woman so many people had dismissed because of her appearance possessed a presence that could not be measured by wealth, status, or beauty. For the second time, she had protected something priceless, and this time, it was someone he loved beyond words. Some promises wait quietly for decades, not because they have been forgotten, but because life has been waiting for the right moment to fulfill them. The days following the museum event brought an unfamiliar sense of reflection to Richard Walker. Every morning he reviewed financial reports, attended executive meetings, and managed responsibilities that had shaped most of his adult life. Yet his thoughts repeatedly returned to Alicia Brooks. He had watched influential people pursue admiration with remarkable determination, but Alicia had earned respect without ever asking for it. She simply lived according to principles that never changed, whether anyone was watching or not. One quiet afternoon, Richard asked his longtime associate to retrieve several old storage boxes from his private estate. Hidden inside a cedar chest were journals, photographs, and keepsakes that had traveled with him through nearly 40 years. He searched patiently until his fingers rested upon a small wooden box wrapped in faded blue cloth. Inside lay a delicate silver pendant shaped like a tiny magnolia blossom, accompanied by a handwritten note whose ink had begun to soften with age. Richard closed his eyes for a long moment as memories returned with surprising clarity. More than 30 years earlier, during one of the most uncertain periods of his life, he had traveled through Seattle under circumstances that required complete anonymity. One rainy afternoon, exhausted and discouraged after receiving devastating personal news, he had stopped at a small neighborhood bakery. The owner had been a warm-hearted black woman named Grace Brooks. She noticed immediately that something weighed heavily upon the quiet stranger sitting alone by the window. Without asking unnecessary questions, she served him a slice of homemade cake and a cup of hot coffee. When he reached for his wallet, she gently shook her head. "Some people need kindness more than receipts," she had said with a gentle smile. Before he left, she handed him the small silver pendant. "I make these for people who forget that tomorrow can still surprise them," she explained. Richard had insisted on paying for it, but Grace refused every dollar. Instead, she smiled once more and said words he had carried ever since. "Kindness is never wasted. Even when it disappears, it always finds its way home." Years later, after learning of Grace's passing through a mutual acquaintance, Richard had carefully preserved the pendant, intending one day to return it to her family if fate ever provided the opportunity. Until meeting Alicia, that opportunity had never arrived. The following Saturday morning, Richard drove personally to Sweet Magnolia Bakery rather than sending an assistant. The familiar aroma of fresh bread welcomed him as customers chatted over coffee and pastries. Alicia looked up from arranging cinnamon rolls in the display case and smiled with genuine surprise. "Good morning, Mr. Walker," she said warmly. "I was not expecting to see you here." Richard returned the smile. "Neither was I, until a memory insisted that I stop by." After the morning rush slowed, Alicia invited him to a quiet table near the front window. Richard carefully placed the small wooden box between them. "I believe this belongs to your family," he said softly. Alicia opened the box with gentle curiosity. The moment she saw the silver magnolia pendant, her eyes widened. "This was my mother's," she whispered. "She told me. She had given one away many years ago, but she never explained to whom." Richard nodded slowly before sharing the story of that rainy afternoon and the unexpected kindness Grace Brooks had shown a complete stranger. Alicia listened without interrupting, her eyes growing moist as she imagined her mother standing behind the counter exactly as she remembered. When Richard repeated the sentence Grace had spoken before he left, Alicia quietly finished the final words with him. "Kindness is never wasted. Even when it disappears, it always finds its way home." For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. The bustling sounds of the bakery faded into the background as both understood that an invisible thread had connected their lives long before they had ever met. Alicia gently held the pendant in her hands before looking at Richard with heartfelt gratitude. "She would have been happy to know you kept your promise," she said softly. Richard smiled with uncommon warmth. "The truth is, Miss Brooks, I did not keep the promise. Your mother did. She trusted that goodness would eventually return, and today she proved she was right." As sunlight streamed through the bakery windows, Richard realized the remarkable woman sitting across from him had inherited far more than her mother's recipes. She had inherited the same quiet ability to change another person's life without ever expecting anything in return, and in that simple realization, the final piece of a decades-old promise gently fell into place. Respect cannot be demanded through power because the deepest respect is always given freely when truth finally steps into the light. Nearly a month after Richard Walker returned the silver magnolia pendant, invitations began arriving in the mailboxes of Seattle's most influential business leaders, philanthropists, educators, and community advocates. The Walker Family Foundation was hosting its annual Legacy Gala, an event known for celebrating individuals whose quiet service had transformed the lives of others. Attendance was considered one of the highest honors within the city's charitable community, and every seat inside the historic Evergreen Civic Ballroom had been reserved. Weeks in advance, Alicia Brooks was surprised when Sweet Magnolia Bakery received a request to prepare the desserts for the evening. She accepted with her usual humility, believing the foundation had simply appreciated the quality of the bakery's work at previous events. She had no idea that Richard himself had personally requested her team. On the evening of the gala, the ballroom glowed beneath towering crystal chandeliers as hundreds of guests filled elegantly decorated tables covered in white linen and fresh magnolia blossoms. Television cameras quietly documented the celebration, while local journalists interviewed distinguished guests arriving at the entrance. Alicia and her co-workers worked behind the scenes, placing carefully crafted pastries on a serving trays before disappearing discreetly into the background. She preferred it that way. Recognition had never been the reason she baked. As the evening progressed, awards were presented to teachers, volunteers, and nonprofit organizations whose work had strengthened neighborhoods across Washington state. Every recipient received warm applause, heartfelt speeches, and standing ovations. Finally, the master of ceremonies approached the podium with a smile. "Ladies and gentlemen, our final recognition this evening comes directly from Mr. Richard Walker himself." The ballroom immediately fell into respectful silence. Richard slowly walked onto the stage wearing a simple black tuxedo. Unlike previous years, he carried no prepared speech. He looked across the audience for several quiet moments before speaking. "Tonight," he began calmly, "I was expected to receive recognition for a lifetime of philanthropy. However, I have come to believe that accepting such recognition would be dishonest." Confused whispers quietly spread through the room. Richard continued without hesitation. "Over the past several weeks, I have met someone who reminded me that generosity without humility is incomplete, and kindness offered without expectation carries more value than any fortune." Many guests exchanged puzzled glances, wondering who he was describing. Richard slowly turned toward the dessert service area. "Miss Alicia Brooks," he said clearly, "would you please join me on this stage?" Alicia looked around in complete surprise, convinced he must have been calling someone else. Her co-workers stared at her with astonishment before encouraging her forward. With quiet uncertainty, Alicia walked through the crowded ballroom as hundreds of eyes followed her every step. Among those watching were several guests who had mocked her appearance during the earlier charity banquet. They recognized her immediately, and the confident smiles they had worn that evening quietly disappeared. Alicia reached the stage and stood respectfully beside Richard, still unsure why she had been invited. Richard faced the audience once more. "Many of you know me because of my success," he said. "Very few of you know the woman standing beside me. Yet I have personally watched her save a charitable event without asking for credit. I have watched her quietly comfort frightened children, support foster families, protect my own granddaughter, and continue serving others after enduring disrespect from people who never took the time to know her." The ballroom became completely still. Richard gently opened a small presentation box containing the silver magnolia pendant's matching display plaque. This woman inherited something far greater than recipes from her late mother. She inherited a life dedicated to preserving the dignity of others. Then, without the slightest hesitation, Richard slowly stepped back, lowered his head, and bowed respectfully before Alicia Brooks. An audible breath swept across the ballroom. Cameras stopped clicking. Conversations disappeared. No one moved. Alicia instinctively stepped forward, embarrassed by the attention, and quietly reached out as though asking him to rise. Richard looked up with a peaceful smile. "No, Miss Brooks," he said softly enough for the microphones to carry his words throughout the hall. "Tonight, I am simply giving respect where it has always belonged." Around the room, the guests who had once judged Alicia by her appearance lowered their eyes in silent reflection. They had arrived expecting to witness another celebration of wealth and influence. Instead, they found themselves watching a powerful man publicly honor a woman whose greatest achievements had been acts of kindness almost nobody had noticed. In that unforgettable silence, every measure of beauty, success, and importance seemed to shift, and for the first time, the entire room truly saw Alicia Brooks exactly as she had always been. The highest form of gratitude is not returning a favor to one person, but creating opportunities that continue blessing countless lives long after both people are gone. The days following the Legacy Gala became the most unexpected chapter of Alicia Brooks's life. Newspaper headlines did not focus on Richard Walker's business achievements or the impressive amount of money raised during the charity event. Instead, photographs of the elderly philanthropist bowing respectfully before an ordinary pastry chef spread across television broadcasts, community newspapers, and social media throughout the Pacific Northwest. Reporters searched for dramatic stories, but the more they learned about Alicia, the more they discovered a woman whose daily life looked exactly the same before and after the attention. She still arrived at Sweet Magnolia Bakery before sunrise. She still greeted every customer with the same warm smile. She still spent her Saturdays delivering birthday cakes to foster children without allowing photographers to follow her. When journalists asked why she had never spoken publicly about her volunteer work, she simply answered, "Kindness grows best when it is not planted for applause." Those few words inspired thousands of people far more than any carefully prepared speech could have. 1 week later, Richard invited Alicia to meet him at an old brick building several blocks from the Seattle waterfront. The structure had once been a neighborhood bakery decades earlier, but had remained vacant for years. Dust covered the windows, and faded paint hinted at memories that had nearly disappeared. Alicia looked at the weathered building with quiet curiosity. Richard handed her a small ring of antique keys. "Open the door," he said gently. Alicia unlocked the entrance and slowly stepped inside. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, revealing wide-open spaces where baking tables had once stood. Richard walked beside her, without speaking, until they reached the center of the empty room. "I have invested in businesses for most of my life," he said calmly. "Some created wealth. Some created influence. Very few created hope." He turned toward Alicia with a peaceful smile. "This one will be different." Alicia looked at him with surprise. Richard continued, "I do not want to build another luxury bakery. Seattle already has enough beautiful places that sell expensive desserts. I want to build a place where opportunity is served every morning." He unfolded architectural drawings across one of the old wooden tables. The plans revealed classrooms, teaching kitchens, counseling offices, childcare rooms, and community dining spaces. Above the entrance appeared a simple name, the Grace Brooks Baking Academy. Alicia covered her mouth as emotion quietly filled her eyes. Richard gently placed his hand over the blueprints. "Single mothers rebuilding their lives will study here. Teenagers leaving foster care will learn professional baking skills. Families recovering from hardship will receive training, mentorship, and employment opportunities. No student will ever pay tuition." Alicia stood silently, unable to find words equal to the moment before her. Richard smiled kindly. "Your mother once taught me that kindness always finds its way home. You reminded me that lesson was never meant for only one person. It was meant to keep traveling." Construction began only weeks later. Volunteers from across Seattle offered their time. Local businesses donated equipment. Experienced chefs volunteered as instructors. Several of the same community leaders who had applauded Alicia during the gala returned, not for another ceremony, but carrying paintbrushes, lumber, ovens, and supplies. Even some of the guests who had once mocked Alicia quietly arrived to help, their actions speaking more honestly than apologies ever could. Alicia welcomed every volunteer with the same grace she had always shown, never mentioning the painful words spoken months earlier. She understood that genuine change deserved encouragement, not humiliation. By autumn, the academy opened its doors to its first class of students. Some arrived carrying little more than hope. Others had never baked anything beyond boxed cake mix. Alicia greeted each person individually, placing a fresh apron into their hands before leading them into the bright teaching kitchen. Above the entrance hung a wooden sign engraved with a sentence taken directly from Grace Brooks's old letter. "The world may notice your appearance first, but your character will decide how long they remember your name." As the first trays of warm bread emerged from the ovens and laughter-filled rooms that had once stood empty, Richard quietly watched from the back of the classroom. He realized that the greatest investment of his entire life had never been measured in dollars, buildings, or recognition. It was measured in the confidence slowly returning to people who had almost forgotten their own worth, all because one quiet woman had spent her life proving that dignity could rise like fresh bread, one hopeful heart at a time. A life becomes truly beautiful not when the world finally applauds it, but when it quietly inspires someone else to believe they are worthy of hope again. 1 year passed, and the Grace Brooks Baking Academy became something far greater than anyone had imagined on the day Richard Walker first unlocked the old brick building. Every morning before sunrise, the kitchens filled with the comforting aroma of fresh bread, cinnamon, butter, and warm coffee. Students of every age gathered around long wooden tables, laughing together while learning recipes that represented more than flour and sugar. They were learning discipline, confidence, patience, and the simple belief that tomorrow could become different from yesterday. More than 300 graduates had completed the program during its first year. Many accepted positions at respected bakeries throughout Washington state. Others opened small neighborhood shops of their own. Several returned to the academy as volunteer instructors, determined to encourage the next class just as they had once been encouraged themselves. The walls displayed photographs not of celebrities or wealthy donors, but of ordinary people smiling proudly beside their first successful cakes, fresh loaves of bread, and graduation certificates. Alicia Brooks refused every suggestion to place her own portrait in the entrance hall. Instead, she insisted that the first thing every visitor should see was the framed letter written by Grace Brooks many years before. Beneath the carefully preserved handwriting rested the silver magnolia pendant, protected inside a simple glass case. Visitors often paused there for several quiet moments before entering the classrooms, reading the familiar words that had become the Academy's guiding principle. The world may notice your appearance first, but your character will decide how long they remember your name. On a bright autumn afternoon, the Academy celebrated its first anniversary with a community open house. Families, former students, business leaders, teachers, and neighborhood volunteers filled the building with cheerful conversation. Children decorated cookies while graduates proudly demonstrated the skills they had mastered over the past year. At one table, a young woman explained that she had once believed no employer would ever hire her after years of hardship, but now she supervised an entire pastry department. Nearby, a former foster teenager carefully helped a little boy frost his very first cupcake, smiling with the quiet confidence that had once seemed impossible. Alicia moved gently through every room, greeting each guest by name whenever she could. She still wore the same simple white chef coat she had worn long before anyone outside the bakery recognized her. Success had never changed the way she spoke, worked, or treated people. She still listened more than she talked. She still thanked every volunteer personally. She still believed every person deserved to leave feeling seen. Richard Walker arrived later that afternoon without photographers or formal announcements. His granddaughter Sophie ran ahead the moment she entered the building, happily embracing Alicia before proudly showing her a tray of cookies she had decorated herself. Richard smiled as he watched the two of them laugh together. Emily quietly joined him near the entrance. "You made a remarkable investment," she said softly. Richard slowly shook his head. "No," he replied with gentle conviction. "I simply recognized someone who had already been investing in people long before I arrived." Together they walked through the academy, observing classrooms filled with hope instead of fear. They watched graduates encouraging newcomers with the same patience Alicia had always shown them. They saw confidence replacing self-doubt one conversation at a time. Nothing inside the building celebrated appearance, popularity, or social status. Everything celebrated growth, kindness, and dignity. Before leaving, Richard paused one final time before Grace's framed letter. Alicia joined him quietly. Neither of them spoke for several peaceful moments as the joyful sounds of students echoed through the halls behind them. Finally, Richard looked toward the busy classrooms and smiled. "Your mother was right," he said softly. Alicia nodded with quiet gratitude. She usually was. Richard looked around once more, watching children laugh, graduates teach, and strangers become a community united by compassion rather than appearance. He realized that the world had never truly changed because one powerful man bowed before a humble woman. The world had changed because that humble woman had never allowed cruelty to convince her that kindness was no longer worth giving. As warm afternoon sunlight filled the academy through its tall windows, Alicia welcomed another new student with the same gentle smile she had offered every person from the very beginning. She had never become someone different after the world finally noticed her. She had simply remained exactly who she had always been, and because of that quiet faithfulness, countless other lives discovered their own worth. And that day, the world remembered what true beauty looks like.